name is Jonathan Silva, trainer here at Pragmatic Works. Welcome into a video where I take a look at how we can start to use Power Automate and Power Automate Desktop together to try to accomplish some of these business process tasks that we have just on a daily basis. For this video, what I'm going to take a look at is taking information that's submitted inside of a Microsoft form and then writing that to an Excel file through a desktop flow. So we're going to go from starting in the cloud with a Microsoft form, taking all the data that's added into that form, extracting the values we want, and then running a desktop flow from the cloud in order to have all that data input inside of an Excel file as an external backup, just in case we want to have another file there to back up the data from that form. So to start off, let's take a look at all the things that we're working with as far as the form and the file that we want to use, and then the setup of our flows, and then jump into Power Automate Desktop to see exactly how we can have this work. All right, so here we are starting online. Right here, I have a basic Microsoft form with 4 different fields that I want to capture. Okay, this is just some basic employee information for some, made-up company here. And what I'm asking inside of this form is for employee ID, name, email, and position within the company. And then what I'd like to do is run a flow to be able to take all of that data and write it inside of this Excel file. So, and you can see in this Excel file, all I just had is, I've had just one field added in this to start off with. But we have our employee ID, our name, our email, and the position. And what I'd like to do is be able to, every time we have another submission on that form, just add in an additional row inside of this Excel file. So we can capture everyone's employee ID as they enter that in. We can capture their name, capture their email, and their position right there. Now, in order to do that on my desktop here, what I'm going to leverage this time is Power Automate Desktop. And with Power Automate Desktop, I'm going to set up a flow to physically take over my computer and write in those values that's being extracted from that Microsoft form. And then once I'm able to do that, I'm going to connect that out to this cloud flow that I've already developed, the first sections of it, to be able to capture every time when a new response is submitted on that employee information form, get those details based on the response ID, and then the next step I'll add in is to launch that desktop flow to take over and add those into the Excel file. So just get started with this. As you can see, our backup information here. Let's go right into our desktop flow here for Power Automate Desktop. Now you'll notice I have one step already added inside of this desktop flow, and that step was a very basic launch Excel. So I searched over here in our far left on our actions area, just simply for Excel, and then I was able to navigate down and just choose Launch Excel. I dragged it into my canvas in the middle, my designer canvas. And what you'll notice on this step here, if I double click to take a look at it, I've decided to launch Excel and open a specific document. In other terms, we could also, or other cases, we could choose a blank document, but I want a specific one that I have already developed for this case. Then I chose the document path on my computer where it's saved. I just put it on my desktop for this case. And in this one, I've decided to make the instance visible because I actually want to see the process happen. I want to just have it in front of me. In most cases, if you're running this, on a large scale, you're probably not going to want the Excel file to open up every time. So you can toggle that off if you want. You can also open as read only as well. Now, some other parts about this. When we are launching this Excel file, you'll notice there is a flow variable that is created right here called Excel instance. In fact, that's it all the way over here. Now, these flow variables are automatically generated by Power Automate Desktop to be able to use inside of this desktop flow. We'll be using this Excel instance later on if we want to close out this specific file, this specific instance, to make sure we're not just having, 150 different Excel instances open at one time when everybody enters in a new form. So I have that first step. Okay, when I run this flow, it opens up my file. It goes down the path and it'll open up my file. Now what I want is to be able to write into each of these columns that I have for my flow. So in order to do that, what I first need to be able to do is decide, okay, how am I going to write into those columns? And then what am I going to use in order to connect these columns and these values into anything that's established on that Microsoft form? So we're going to have to establish some input variables to be able to capture this data that is going to be used as dynamic content from our Cloudflow to be able to be passed through our desktop flow into that Excel file. So we're going to establish 1, 2, 3, 4 different input variables based on employee ID, name, email, and position. And then we're going to take those variables and add them into actions here inside of our desktop flow to write to an Excel worksheet. So let's add those variables first because it's fresh in our mind. We know exactly what we want to see. And we'll do that over here. So the first one, add an argument. I'm going to choose an input. Now, some of the naming conventions I like to use is to call out to what exactly I'm establishing. So the first thing is var in, so it's an input variable. And remember, the first set that we want to create, if I come to my Excel file, is employee ID. So I'm going to call this var in employee ID for my variable name. And then I'm going to go ahead inside of my default value and just decide, maybe in this case, I'll do, number 2. And it doesn't really matter here because we're going to make this dynamic anyway. Okay, but this default value, if I were just going to run and test the flow, this is what's going to be entered in to the next row here each time. My external name right here, anything we put in our external name, this is what will show up when we come into our Cloudflow later on as one of the actions in here. So we're going to call this, nice and simply, employee ID. And then in our description, this will be inside of that text box that we can add information in. So I'm going to put employee ID, something pretty quick there. We don't always have to add a description. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. We can add a sensitivity label here if we'd like. In this case, we don't really need it because it's just kind of some dummy data. But if you're using data that is sensitive, you can go ahead and do that and it'll hide all these other values. And then I can hit create. So now I have one of my variables. We need to create 3 more in order to capture the name, the email, and the position as well. So let's go ahead and create those 3 variables there. Another input variable. This is our var in name, or employee name. Our default value here, maybe we'll put Mary at the Smiths. I'm just going to use some basic common names in the United States here, .com. External name will be name, and description, maybe we can put employee name, a little bit more descriptive there. I will go ahead and create that. We'll add in another one, another input variable to remember what we have. There's our email, and the last one will be position. So we'll have var in email. Default value here, we'll just do Mary at the Smiths.com. And our external name will be email. Okay, pretty simple. Now I've just realized as I did this one, my var in name, I added her email address by accident. Let's just get rid of that and put Mary Smith. There, fixed that one. We don't have any confusion there. And then in our next one, and our very last one, we can put in Mary's position within the organization. Our variable will be var in position. We can have our default value. Mary is our CFO. And our external name, we'll just put position. Make it nice and simple. We don't need to add a description. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So now we have all of our input variables created. So let's go ahead and add an action here and multiple actions here in order to write to this Excel worksheet. So to add this action, we can either double click over here for write to Excel worksheet or drag and drop in the exact place we want. And we want it obviously after we launch Excel. And now when we write to this Excel worksheet, what we need to do is be able to pull in details. But wait, we can't actually write to the worksheet yet because we actually haven't decided where we are writing. if you think about it, if we just leave this write to Excel worksheet right here, we're not going to be able to determine where we are writing. It's just going to take whatever is there, that first area there, and then run it. Or we have to manually declare which row, which column. Well, we want this to be dynamic, right? We want it to be every time there's another form submitted, we want to take the next row available on each of these columns. Well, if that's the case, we need to think about this. We actually need to create another set of variables here for us to be able to utilize. So if we come back here, let's get rid of that one. We first want to get the first free column and row or row on that Excel worksheet. When we use this, what we now get are two variables that allow us to determine either the first free column or first free row, whichever we want to utilize. In this case, we are going to be using this first free row on all of those write to Excel steps because it now bumps us down to the next row available so we can input across that row within each of those 4 columns. So let's go ahead and do that to make sure we can actually write into the correct place each time. Select Save. And now we can see we have more flow variables to be able to use inside of this flow. Right? All of these variables work inside the desktop flow. All of these input and output variables up here, they can be used not just inside the desktop flow, but also and outside the flow, which means we can use them in the cloud as well. Right? This is where we're going to pull in some of our dynamic content to associate with our variables later on. So now that we are able to get the first free row, let's go ahead and write to that Excel worksheet. Here we go. Let's write it there. Now the value to write. Okay, well, let's think about this. We want to go ahead in order here on our Excel worksheet. So we first want that employee ID to be written in. So let's add in our variable that we've established to make this dynamic. So every time we have the form, the new employee ID that's captured will be put in here. To put that variable, let's just select it right over here. So we can scroll down. There it is, var in employee ID. I'm going to select it right there. And now which column do I want to put it on? Well, I want to put it on the first one, so column A. Which row do I specifically want to put it on? Well, remember, we've just been able to get the first free row or column from that worksheet. So let's utilize that variable to be able to move it down the list each time. So we're going to select first free row. And now we have our very first option done. So let's go ahead and hit save. So now we think about this. We want to have every time the form is submitted, we want to be able to write in that employee ID into column A right here, but we also want to find the first free row on column A. So after the next submission, it should go to row 3. After that, row 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on and so on. Or we want that to be dynamic right there. Now let's go ahead and establish B, C, and D. One of the great things here about Power Automate and the desktop edition is we can very easily copy out steps. So you can right click here, choose to copy or Control C, and then Control V to have all 4 of those columns. Now all we need to do is edit out both the value to write and the column that we are going to put this in. So for our second one here, we are going to get rid of that var employee ID. We'll add in our name. Select it there. We want to put the name on column B and then hit save. Again, we're going to keep it on the first free row, right? Each time we want to make sure we're moving across. So let's do the same, double click for this one, remove our value to write there for our variable. We now want their email, so we can put that in as well. Change the column to C and hit save. And then the last one here, we want their position. So we're going to find that variable that we've created, select it there, column D, keep that in that first free row, hit save. So now our desktop flow is good. We are now able to use this desktop flow. We can save it in this case, and then do a test run to make sure this is actually working. Now, when we do this test run, right, the first thing that we're going to notice as we do the test run is it's going to take in the default value that we've established for those variables. So we should be able to see our employee number 2 for Mary Smith, her email address, and her position. That should be written to that Excel file. Then later on, when we associate this with the Cloudflow, that will be dynamically changing based upon any of the submissions into the form. But when we test it here, the default items here, that's what you'll see right away. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first one as we test it. I'm going to make sure I close out my Excel instance so we know we're not having any extra stuff running in the background. And I'm going to hit run, and let's take a look at the computer taking over here. So it's now going to go through the steps there. Go ahead and launch that Excel file. There it is. It went pretty quick there. You'll notice my Excel file automatically opened down here. And now we can see I haven't done anything. There's our second one, employee ID, Mary Smith, Mary at the Smiths, CFO. We have our CEO, John. She's the CFO. Let's add in a third one now, but let's do it instead of directly through our desktop flow. Let's do it through the cloud. So let's go ahead. I'll save this, close it. Right, we can add in, by the way, when we close Excel, we can add a step to save that instance as well when we launch our close Excel to make sure that it is saving, so we don't hit manually save each time. But let's go ahead and come into our Cloudflow here. And on our Cloudflow, if you remember, we already have 2 steps established. We have our trigger here, okay, when a new response is submitted on that employee information form. We're going to get those response details to be able to use later on. And the next thing we need to do is select new step and connect that to our desktop flow. Now we can choose run a flow built with Power Automate Desktop right here. And now when we have that, we can choose which flow we want to run. I'm going to use write from form to Excel. And then we can decide the flow or the run mode for this. So we want to choose attended when we're signed in. That's based on your licensing. I only have, in this case, this is a trial license here for RPA. We can do attended. And now you'll notice there are the 4 different variables. These are the input variables or input parameters that we established back on the desktop. Now we can utilize them in the cloud. And you'll notice this provides us the external name that we've had right in here. You'll notice I didn't put anything there, but we have our descriptions. If you had a description, it would be established right there. Pretty nice to see. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to use the response details from the form inside of each of these steps here. So we're going to add in some of that dynamic content from this form. Whatever was added in for our email, I want to put that in my email here. So we're going to choose our dynamic content for the answer to the email question. We'll do the same thing for the name. Now we could capture this automatically based on the form itself, but we'll just have it as a quick answer there. The position and the employee ID. Now that we've associated our dynamic content from our form into our desktop flow, if we select save, we can go ahead and test this to see if it is working. So I'm going to come into, you can see the flow is ready to go. Recommend you test it. So I'm going to choose a test up here. We've already saved it. We're going to do a manual test here. Submit a new response. I'm going to select test. And now, once this is good, we can come over to our form and add in a new value. Maybe I'll put employee ID number 3. Maybe our employee name is Mike Smith. I'm just coming up with some random names here. This is going to be Mike at thesmiths.com. And his position, he might be vice president. Okay, we could just add that like that, right? Just coming up with a new ID, new name, just coming up on the fly. Now, when I hit submit, we're going to go ahead and take a look and see if our flow is running, and then we're going to see how it connects out to our desktop flow. So let's go ahead and hit submit right there. New response was submitted. Let's take a look at our flow. It should be running. Oh, we can see it's captured the response, captured the response details. Now it's going through the process to run the flow build Power Automate Desktop. Now, when we connect to a desktop flow, this tends to go a little bit slower in this case. It just takes a little bit more time. It's got to go down and make that, in this case, I did a machine connection instead of a gateway, connect out to that machine, and then run the flow. You can see there's my Excel file down below that's already been done. Let's take a look. It's almost complete here. I'm going to wait for this check. There it is, ran successful. Let's take a look. Do we have another value? Employee ID 3, Mike Smith, Mike at the Smiths, and our vice president. So now every time that flow or that form is submitted, we are now going to be able to extract those values, connect to our desktop flow, and automatically write it into here. So the last step I would do here is going back to my desktop flow. We can come into our desktop flow and choose to close Excel. Once all this is complete, we want to say, hey, that Excel instance that was just opened and written to, let's close it, that exact one, and make sure before closing, we save it. Add that in there. One last step. Now we can have in every other submission from that point. It'll grab that from the form. It'll connect to the desktop flow. It will write it there. And by the way, when we did launch Excel, we could just take this away. We don't need to see it visible. It'll just write it in the back end, write it all automatically, and then it'll close it. Open it, close it, we won't see it, but it'll be written there anyway. And we can have this run for us so we never have to worry about, okay, I'm gonna take someone's name information, put it over here, take it, put it over here. Set up that form, let it do the work for us. It makes our lives that much easier. Thanks for joining me again today. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more insight in how you can start to leverage Power Automate in the cloud and Power Automate Desktop together. This is a pretty basic use case for this, but probably something a lot of us can start to use right away in our daily work. Think of all the different ways you can either have forms connected into desktop flows, SharePoint lists connected into desktop flows. These are kind of the basic ones that we have that work really, really well as we can write them into Excel. Stay tuned for some of my future series here and future videos coming out with Power Automate and Power Automate Desktop as I start to try to give it a little bit more use cases, tips and tricks along the way. Thanks for joining me again. My name is Jonathan Silva. See you around.